You ever get that feeling that things are just getting a little chaotic? You look at the news, the political divisions, the social unrest, and it just feels like the ground beneath our feet is shaking. Well, you're not alone. And in this explainer, we're going to dig into why that might be happening. But here's the big question, right? Is all this instability just random, a bit of bad luck? Or what if there are deep, powerful forces at work, patterns that repeat themselves throughout history, pushing us toward a breaking point? That's the real mystery we're diving into today. And a great way to think about this comes from the political scientist Jack Goldstone. He says social upheavals are a lot like earthquakes. See, it's not just about the one day everything shakes. It's about the slow, immense pressure that builds up for years, even decades, deep underground. Those are the structural conditions. And then you have the trigger, the sudden event that lets all that energy loose. To understand the earthquake, you have to understand the pressure first. Okay, so let's start there. Let's look at those deep structural pressures that just build and build, often totally out of sight. Our first major clue in this whole mystery comes from another political scientist, Peter Turchin. He pointed to a critical fault line that he saw running through societies right before they hit a crisis, and he gave it a name: elite overproduction. So what in the world is that? Well, think of it this way. It's what happens when a society gets really, really good at producing highly educated, super ambitious people who all expect a seat at the top table. But the number of chairs at that table isn't growing. You have a huge surplus of would-be leaders, thinkers, and managers, and their path is blocked. This creates incredibly intense zero-sum competition that can get really, really nasty. And the crazy thing is, this isn't some new 21st century problem. Nope. The philosopher Francis Bacon was warning about this exact same thing nearly 400 years ago. He saw that when you educate more people for power than you have positions of power, you're basically creating a recipe for serious discontent. It's a pattern as old as time. And this chart just lays it all out perfectly. Look at this. The number of actual elite jobs in a society, it kind of inches up, right? Slowly. But then you look at the number of people with the degrees and the ambition who want those jobs, and that line is skyrocketing. That massive widening gap you see, that's a huge pool of frustrated, highly qualified people who start to feel like the system is rigged. And they often become what Turchin calls counter-elites, the very people who end up leading revolutions. Okay, so you've got a bunch of angry, frustrated elites. So what? Why is that so dangerous? Well, it's because this kind of infighting can start to crack the very foundations of a society, the basic rules of the game that keep everyone from, well, fighting all the time. To really get this, we need to zoom out a bit. A team of economists came up with this brilliant framework. They basically said, look, throughout all of history, societies have really only found two main ways to stop powerful people from constantly going to war with each other. On one side, you have what we're probably familiar with, the open access order. Think of most modern developed countries. The state controls violence, and the economy is based on open competition. But for most of human history, that's not how it worked at all. You had what's called a limited access order, or a natural state. And here, the peace is basically bought. The most powerful groups agree not to fight because the system is set up to grant them special economic privileges, what economists call rents. The key takeaway is this: in these systems, peace is profitable. You have a direct financial reason to cooperate. So what are these rents they're all getting? It sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Think of them as special privileges handed out by the state. Imagine the government gives only your company the exclusive right to sell internet service in the whole country. All that extra profit you make because you have no competition, that's a rent. It's basically a bribe from the system to the powerful. Stay in line and you'll get rich. Step out of line and the money stops. It's a very practical way to buy stability. So that's the deal that keeps the peace. But what happens when one side breaks that deal? What happens when the state itself decides to change the rules and cut some of its most powerful players out of the game? For a perfect real-world example of this, let's travel back to 18th century Mexico, which was then under Spanish rule. The Bourbon reforms are a classic case study in how to break a bargain with your elites. So here's how it went down. For a long, long time, the local power players in Mexico had a sweet deal. They managed the collection of a major sales tax, which gave them power and, more importantly, those valuable rents. But then, in 1776, the Spanish crown got greedy. They needed more cash, so they just took over. They centralized tax collection, cutting the local elites out completely. And just like that, the deal was off. The loyalty those elites had to Spain, gone. It just vanished.
And this timeline shows you exactly what happened next. The reforms create this deep anger in 1776, and that anger is just sitting there, simmering under the surface for decades. Then, bam, 1808, Napoleon invades Spain. The central government is suddenly weak, distracted. That's the trigger. When peasant rebellions finally kick off in 1810, they spread like an absolute wildfire, especially in those areas where the local elites who no longer felt any loyalty to the crown just sat on their hands and let it happen. The broken bargain created the perfect storm.
And this is what you get when a state's authority crumbles. It's a concept called an oligopoly of violence. It sounds complicated, but it just means the government's monopoly on the use of force is gone. It's a free-for-all, where power is split between multiple, competing, armed factions, all fighting for control. Okay, so we've got elite overproduction, creating this massive pool of frustrated talent, and we know how breaking bargains with those elites can lead to total chaos. So, how does any of this connect to our own time, to what some are calling the turbulent 20s? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Peter Turchin didn't just have a theory. He actually built a model to measure these pressures. He combined a bunch of different data points into one single number he calls the Political Stress Indicator, or PSI. Think of it like a weather forecast for social instability. First up, it tracks the economic pain of everyday people. When real wages for the majority of the population just stop growing for a long period of time, people start to feel like the system is rigged, that they're falling behind no matter how hard they work. This creates a huge potential for mass protests and unrest. The second ingredient? You guessed it, it's the one we started with, elite overproduction. The model tracks that growing number of elite aspirants and the intense political polarization that comes from them, all fighting over a shrinking number of top spots. And the final piece of the puzzle is the health of the state itself. And a huge red flag here is when government debt starts to explode, especially when there's no major war going on. Why? Because it suggests the state might be too fiscally fragile, too weak or broke to handle a real crisis when it finally hits. Okay, so here's the part that's kind of mind-blowing. Way back in 2010, Turchin took all these data points, stagnant wages, elite overproduction, rising debt, and he plugged them into his model. And the model spit out a very specific, testable prediction. It said that the United States was on a collision course with a major period of political instability, and that it would likely peak right around the year 2020. A full decade in advance, the data was basically screaming that a political earthquake was on its way. And all of this leaves us with one massive, absolutely critical question. If these great historical upheavals aren't just random bolts from the blue, if they are, in fact, the result of measurable pressures that build up over a long time, then that changes everything. If we are getting better at seeing the fault lines and detecting the tremors, the real question for us is, can we learn to diffuse the pressure? Can we, maybe for the first time in history, actually see the earthquake coming and prevent the quake?